Welcome to the Real News Network, and welcome to Reality Asserts Itself. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. Of all the official narrative that tries to explain the world in the interests of those who control U.S. foreign policy, perhaps nothing is as powerful as the influence of how the media covers Israel-Palestine, a country which is cleared by the United Nations and independent journalists and commissions that have investigated the situation. Israel clearly has an illegal occupation of Palestinian lands. It has committed war crimes in its attacks on Gaza and other places. Yet the prevailing public opinion, and certainly the prevailing media and political opinion, is Israel's the victim in all of this. There's a new film that tries to explain why Americans think this way. The film is called The Occupation of the American Mind, Israel's Public Relations War in the United States. And now joining me is the executive producer of the film and the narrator of the film. First of all, in the studio is Jhally. He's professor of communications at the University of Massachusetts and founder and executive director of the Media Education Foundation. Sut's been involved in the production of more than 75 films, most recently, as I said, executive producer of The Occupation of the American Mind. And joining us from Los Angeles is Roger Waters. He's the narrator of The Occupation of the American Mind. He's an English musician, singer-songwriter, and composer. Best known as the bass player, co-lead vocalist, lyricist, principal songwriter of the very famous band Pink Floyd. Over the last few years, he's emerged as a prominent advocate for Palestinian human rights. Thank you very much for joining us, Roger and Sut.
Pleasure to be here.
Roger, let me start with a somewhat personal question to you, and then we'll kind of get into the film more. One of your best-known songs is The Wall. You made a film with the name. The wall, which is the separation wall between Israel and Palestine, or the current occupied territories, has become a major symbol for you in terms of the way you've written about the wall, a passion for you politically. You've talked a bit in previous interviews about breaking down your own personal walls. This wall's a metaphor at many levels for you. When this sort of wall about not just being political in terms of having opinions and thinking, but breaking down that wall where you decide you have to put your neck out, you have to be an activist, you have to actually get out and change the world in a very active way. Why is it the Israel-Palestine question that seems to be the one that galvanizes you?
Well, I've seen that wall. I mean, I saw that wall 10 years ago. I went to Israel. They tacked a gig on at the end of a European tour in Tel Aviv. And that was really the start of my involvement in all this, because I accepted to do that show. And I was then approached by, among many others, by Omar Barghouti. And we had long conversations, and I started to learn a little bit about the situation. And in fact, I cancelled my gig on his and many hundreds of other people's recommendations. I did perform in Israel in 2006, but I moved the show to a agricultural community called Neve Shalom, or Wahat Asalam, I think is the Arab name for it, which is about halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And it's an ecumenical community where Jews and Arabs and Muslims, Christians and Druze all live together and grow chickpeas, and their children all go to the same school. And so it's a very cool example. So we did the gig there, and it was a huge success, but I realized that I was playing to an entirely segregated audience. There were only Jewish Israelis there. And also at the end of the show, they were extremely enthusiastic, I have to say, and very knowledgeable about the work that I was doing. But at the end of the show, when I made a very short speech about how they were the generation of Israelis who needed to start communicating with their neighbors and make peace, they went very, very blank. This was not in the script. And they are following a script. And what Sut's movie is about the fact that the citizens of the United States of America are also following the script. And the scripts are remarkably similar because they both derive from the same Orwellian Ministry of Truth, which is the campaign of Hasbro, or the explaining of the Israeli situation to the rest of the world. And so that was one indication that I had in 2006 that things were kind of screwy. I went back in 2007 under the protection of the United Nations, and I traveled around the West Bank extensively with a lovely woman called Allegra Baceo, who was working for UNRWA at the time.
Is this when you made the film?
Yeah, we made a little clip of spray painting slogans on the wall in around the refugee camp in Bethlehem. But in traveling around the West Bank at that time, I had meetings with some of the elders in the refugee camp in Jenin up in the north, and I drove all the way down there. Through the east as well, all the way down the Jordan River, and came back through Jericho. And it's chilling when you actually see it with your own eyes, to see apartheid in operation in a country that is almost entirely supported by the United States of America, that makes claims about liberty, freedom and equality and so on. In fact, it's enshrined in the constitution of this country, that all men are created equal and so on and so forth. It's chilling to see a system of military occupation being operated where there is no question of people being treated equally, that one set of people are colonizing the land and the other set of people have no rights at all of any kind. And so confronted with something like that, feelings well up, and I think it's entirely natural for anybody of good faith to say, we have to organize and do something about this. Right. And Soot's movie, The Occupation of the American Mind, is one of the best tools of activism that I've seen, and I was extremely pleased to be able to act as the narrative for it, right, because it very cogently tells the story of how the American public have been deceived since 1947 as to the reality on the ground in Israel.
So how long did it take to make this film? And it's a difficult film to make, because as you're making it, you got to know that it's going to be hard to show this anywhere in the United States.
It took us a while to make. Actually, we started this over 5 years ago. We actually had made a previous film that came out in 2004 called Peace Propaganda in the Promised Land, which was about comparing American media coverage with European media coverage. And then, it deals with some similar issues. But then when the Gaza attacks first happened, it seemed as though something new was happening, and so we started to work on a new film. It was the first Gaza attack in 2008, and then we didn't know that while we were working on the film, that another 2 attacks would happen at the same time. That was why we worked on the film.
Yeah, I mean, that was an astounding moment. The bombs raining down on Gaza, thousands of injuries and deaths, and Israel's the victim.
And Israel's the victim, and there is support massive public support in the U.S. For the attacks.
A resolution gets passed in the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, I mean, the Senate is almost unanimous around this, and so it's that discongruence between the reality on the ground and American perceptions and opinions of it. And as someone who studies public opinion and someone who looks at public relations and propaganda, I know public opinion doesn't come out of nowhere. Public opinion is formed. Public opinion is created. And so that was why I first got interested in looking at this, was how is American public opinion formed around this? Actually, my first interest in this was, I teach at the University of Massachusetts. And about 10 years ago, I started to do surveys in my class. The very first class I would have during the semester, I would ask these students, so liberal students at a liberal university, I would ask them not what they thought, but what they knew. And I asked them a question, said, okay, and so I asked them a factual question, and which was, which of the following countries has been continually condemned in the United Nations for occupying someone else's land? Yes, it's an objective question, the answer to which is Israel. And so I gave them 4 answers that they could choose. One was Israel, one was, couldn't call it Palestine, called them the Palestinians, and then a couple of countries it couldn't possibly be. And what I found was, over a period of 3 years when I did this, between 58% and 63% of my students thought the Palestinians were illegally occupying someone else's land. And so that was where how does this happen? How can you have this kind of reality?
We've seen this in other polling across the country, that a majority opinion, at least used to, I'm not sure where it is now, used to have the same idea.
Yeah, so so I was interested, how can reality be turned on its head?
All right, well, let's show a clip from the film, and then we'll discuss more about how this works.
There's really no way to fully understand why the Palestinian people have resisted Israel for so long without understanding this basic history of dispossession and occupation. But for the most part, this isn't the story we get in American media coverage. Instead, the legitimate grievances of Palestinians, including their right to resist an illegal military occupation, get pushed out of the frame by this constant discussion about extremism and terrorism and anti-Semitism.
You know, rational, clear-minded people understand that Hamas is a terror group and it is committed to killing Jews and wiping Israel off the face of the earth. That's not debatable. That's a fact.
It's never about land, somehow. That gets dropped out. It's never about settlements. It's always about they hate us because we're Jewish.
Whatever the Palestinians have done is portrayed in terms of mindless violence against Jews out of some kind of primeval anti-Semitism. No sense of how this started, where the animus comes from. It's completely inexplicable in the way in which it's generally presented, and these people basically kill because they hate, and they hate because they're irrational Muslim fanatics or whatever.
And I think Americans largely get it. They know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are.
This is not an illusion. American public opinion is generally supportive of Israel because it's been led to believe that Israel is in the right and the Arabs are bad guys.
None of this is by accident. It's the result of a deliberate effort to shape American perceptions of the conflict. A propaganda effort that really begins to take shape with Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982.
So this film is about a public relations exercise, conscious, planned, and this is the film introduces the concept here. This framing of how Israel is the victim and Palestinians somehow hate Jews, and this is why they can't live or abide living next to an Israeli state, a Jewish state. How does this get to be so pervasive that a majority of American opinion, even when they're shown images of children dying in Gaza, in the attacks on Gaza, and in fact, in the last attack on Gaza, I was kind of struck. It seemed to me for the first time almost, the New York Times actually showed pictures of dead children. You actually got some sense of what it had done to people. You could still have Senate resolutions calling this a right of Israeli right to self-defense and such.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Israeli spokesperson, actually said in the war of pictures we lose. So you have to explain, you have to frame the pictures, and that's what Israel has done. It's a massive propaganda campaign to flood the airwaves with explanations for why there are these dead children, and why the blame for the dead children rests in the hands of Hamas and Palestinians and not Israel. And so that's a challenge that Israel recognizes, that these pictures could be very damaging. However, one of the things we know about public relations is pictures never tell a story by themselves. You can always give a different interpretation to the pictures. You can always give a different interpretation to the story. In fact, it's Gore Vidal once talked about the lesson of Confucius, that Confucius was once asked what he would do if he were ever to run the state. That is, if he was in charge, what would he do? And Confucius answered by saying he would, quote, rectify the language. And what he meant by that was if you can control the stories, if you can control the language, then you can control the categories through which people think about the world. And you don't need police and military on street corners. You can colonize people in their own imaginations, in their own heads.
And as you point in the film, one of the most important ingredients of that is repetition, which is kind of why we're doing the real news. It's the daily repetition that makes this thing, shapes people's worldview when they see these events unfold.
Yeah, and that's the way public relations works. It doesn't work by one message by itself. It works by being this cumulative effect over a long period of time. So even if you have one message that comes the other way, it has no impact when the flood of messages is going in the other direction.
Roger, how much were you affected yourself by the sort of official narrative in the media? You had actually booked that concert. Once you got there and you were able to see with your own eyes and talk to people, you changed the venue. But before you went, how much were you influenced by the main narrative yourself?
I'm not sure that it impinged on me greatly. I've been kind of, I hate to say it, but I've been sort of busy doing my work for most of my life. I've worked really hard. I really enjoy my work, so I'm sort of engaged in it. And the story tends to go by somewhere in the background until you're confronted with it face to face in a personal, upfront way, and then you have to respond to it. But further to what you guys were saying about what happens, never mind the theory, which is all very interesting, but you're having a kind of an academic conversation about public relations. The fact is that the system that the Israeli powers that be have, the Hasbro, the explaining of their situation, is not actually explaining anything. It's a euphemism to suggest explaining. They are telling a big lie, and they are repeating it over and over and over again. And they are also persuading some of the lackeys that they have in this country, for instance. Hillary Clinton's a very good example of this, to repeat the lie for them. And they all repeat the same lie over and over again. So in Soot's movie, it's very, very well illustrated. In fact, you used it yourself just now. You talked about bombs raining down on Gaza. Okay, well, that's a perfectly legitimate description for what happened, not just in Protective Edge in 2014, but also in Cast Lead in 2008-9. Bombs rained down on Gaza. The big lie that they tell when there's ever any conflict or ever any bombing of anyone is, and the missiles rained down. And in this movie, you hear people saying it countless times. Hillary said it about 10 times in the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, like 2 weeks ago in the debate with Sanders, when Sanders was trying to make the point that there are two sides to this story. That's all he was. But what he was doing there was completely revolutionary, because he's the first politician that we've heard in the United States even suggesting that there might be two sides to this story. So it's really interesting, the language that they use, that's been, well, Soot knows better than I, that has been taught to them by Frank Lutz and others, who've said, this is how you affect public opinion. You lie to people, and these are the words that you must choose to tell the lie with. But our policy is to tell a big lie, and the big lie is this: we are little David, and we are being attacked by Goliath. And Goliath is these awful terrorists who surround us and who are constantly attacking us. And we, much as we hate it, have to defend ourselves. And that is why sometimes we need to take to the skies with our drones and our F-16s and whatever it is that they, and that is the big lie that they tell. And so the narrative, which actually the real narrative is that exactly the opposite is true. That Israel is not David, Israel is Goliath. And their attacks upon Gaza, particularly because the people there are incarcerated in an open-air prison and are entirely defenseless against attack from the air and the sea. They defend their attacks on Gaza on the grounds that they are defending themselves. They're not defending themselves. What they're doing is they are what they describe as mowing the grass or mowing the lawn. which is a disgusting euphemism to use about the slaughter of neighbouring peoples who happen to be inhabiting land that you covet. This is the real story of what's going on. The story is that the Israeli government, I'm not talking about Jewish people, I'm not talking even about the Israeli people, though a lot of them, I have to say, do support the actions of their government. But this very, very right-wing government that is in power in Israel at the moment is determined, and it's as plain as a pikestaff to see, to occupy forever all the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and between the Lebanese border and the Sinai. That is their determination, and they're doing it willy-nilly, and they're pretending not to do it. So part of their big lie is, we want to make peace with our neighbors. No, they don't. That is just a barefaced lie. But if you say that, you then get a spokesperson for the Israeli government will come on and say the lie again, exactly the same lie. They'll say it again. We want peace, we're just defending ourselves. The rockets rain down, and they go on saying the same thing over and over and over again. Now, this might be okay in a country like the United States of America for the people to make up their minds about what the true narrative is, except that they're not being given a chance to look at the narrative, which is why you and I are here today to help Sud persuade the media to show his movie to the people, so the people of the United States may make up their own minds as to what's going on and who is the victim and who is the perpetrator, whether the occupying army, the IDF, or the Israeli occupation force, whether that's Goliath, whether they are the oppressors, or whether it's the people who are being woken up in the middle of the night and having their kids dragged off to prison, whether they are the oppressors. But the film has to be shown so that people get a chance to see the other side of the narrative.
Okay, so we're going to continue this discussion in multiple parts, at which I hope you will come back and watch the part 2. But before we go, how do people watch this film?
We have a website. It's called www.occupationmovie.com, and you can watch the movie there. You can stream it for $5, or we hope people will give more. You can also buy the film as a DVD. And so we hope a lot of people will go directly to the site and be able to watch the film immediately after this interview.
Another way you can get to the film streaming, which is I think $5 to watch the film, or you can buy a DVD, is on the Real News homepage. You'll see a copy of this movie poster. If you click on it, it will take you to the page where you can get to the film.
Why isn't it on HBO? Why isn't it in one of the places where it's readily available for large numbers of cable customers, certainly, to get it without them having to search around the net, and without them having to find this particular website, or without them having to look for it? This is important information for every citizen of the United States to have at their fingertips. It should be in every home so that people can look at it, and then they get a chance to start forming an opinion about the situation vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine.
Well, why it's not on Netflix or mainstream media, we are going to get into exactly that topic as we work our way through the interview. So please join us for part 2 of our interview with Jhally and Roger Waters on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, continuing our discussion with Jhally and Roger Waters about the new film, The Occupation of the American Mind, Israel's Public Relations War in the United States. as I mentioned in the first section. So Jhally is executive producer of this film and has produced many such documentaries. And Roger Waters is the co-founder or founder of Pink Floyd and one of their lead vocalists and principal songwriter, and has become a real activist advocating for Palestinian human rights. I'm going to show another clip from the film, and then we're going to talk about just how this narrative Israel of the victim and all Palestinian resistance is terrorism, how that becomes the predominant narrative. So we're going to roll that clip now.
Israel can saturate the media with its spokespeople, but there's still the problem of massive Palestinian casualties showing up on television screens. You can't make those images go away. An Israeli official actually said, "In the war of pictures, we lose." So you need to correct, explain, or balance it in other ways. Here again, the Luntz document spells out which talking points have been most effective in spinning the brutal reality of Palestinian casualties. He says the first thing the pro-Israeli spokespeople should do is to express empathy for the innocent victims.
Unfortunately, innocents do get hurt, and we really grieve that.
We're sad for every civilian casualty.
The entire situation is tragic.
Once you've done that, Luntz says, you also have to get people to empathize with Israelis by describing what life is like for them, living in constant fear of Hamas rocket attacks. So again and again, we hear the focused, tested phrase that the rockets are raining down on Israel.
We have thousands of rockets raining down on our civilians.
Rockets were raining down on Israel.
Any advertising executive will tell you the essence of propaganda is repetition.
Rockets raining down on southern Israel.
Rockets raining down on Israel.
Well, Hamas rockets rain down on Israeli border towns.
Then Luntz tells PR spokespeople to turn the tables and ask the American people, what would you do?
So what would you do in the United States?
Can you imagine what America would do if it were facing a similar threat?
We always try to ask you the question we ask ourselves. What will you do?
What would you do?
What would you do if more than 3,000 rockets had been fired on your cities?
What would you do? 3,000 rockets.
What would you do if terrorists were tunneling under your frontier?
What would you do if 3 kids are kidnapped because of a tunnel network?
What sort of question is this? Of course, anybody would act to defend themselves against unprovoked aggression, but it is a question that is completely devoid of any context. What drives the society to a point where after multiple devastating wars, they continue to resist with these most feeble methods? They don't want you to ask that question. They don't want you to ask what is behind this. What's the history here? Who are these people? Where did they come from? Why are they so desperate? No. They want you to understand Israeli behavior. Israeli behavior is always characterized as a reaction to unprovoked violence.
So the point you're making here is that this is no accident. This is a very calculated PR plan, the way Procter & Gamble rolls out a new toothpaste, which I guess with even some of the same kind of methodology and technology. Talk about how this developed.
Well, the start of the modern campaign we can trace back to 1982. And in fact, American audiences would be stunned at the kind of coverage that the American networks gave to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. It was incredibly critical and showed the horror of both the invasion and then the slaughter at the camps of Shabra and Shatila. And Israel was horrified at the kind of, at real journalism taking place. And they essentially said, we can't let this happen again. And so they set about with a very calculated, coordinated campaign, which they called the Hasbro Project, that was going to be designed to control the discourse in the United States. And there was a conference that took place in 1984 in which they gathered together many, many people, experts in public relations, in advertising, in communications, to come up with this strategy.
Okay, let's roll a clip from the film, which is about exactly this conference.
2 years after the Lebanon invasion, the American Jewish Congress sponsored a conference in Jerusalem to devise a formal public relations strategy known in Hebrew as Hasbra. Participants included PR and advertising executives, media specialists, journalists, and leaders of major Jewish groups. According to a brochure from the Congress,
No single event brought home the need for a more effective Hasbro or information program more persuasively than the 1982 war in Lebanon and the events that followed. As one conference participant put it, Israel is no longer perceived to be Little David, but Goliath steamrolling across the map. The primary aim of the conference was to develop strategies to spin unpopular Israeli policies and to counter negative press coverage by shaping the media frame in advance. News doesn't just jump into a camera, a conference delegate said. It's directed, it's managed, it's made accessible. Israel-based advertising executive Martin Fenton would put it in even more blunt terms. Propaganda is not a dirty word, he said. Face it, we are in the game of changing people's minds, of making them think differently. To accomplish that, we need propaganda. The conference was chaired by US advertising executive Carl Spielvogel, the legendary ad man who created the highly acclaimed Miller Lite beer ads in the 1970s.
The choice of Spielvogel makes perfect sense. He's known as a master of image inversion and rebranding. The ad man responsible for transforming Miller Lite, which had been viewed before as a woman's beer, into a manly beer that tough guys would drink.
The best part is that it tastes so great.
The best part is it's less filling.
Nah, it tastes great.
Less filling.
His job with Israel would require the same kind of rebranding, only in the opposite direction, to help soften the image of a country that's coming to be seen as a bully. So he recommends creating a cabinet post dedicated exclusively to explaining policy, whose job would not be setting policy, but presenting it in the most attractive way to the rest of the world.
Classic PR is to say the problem is not the policy, it's the presentation. When the policies are so reprehensible that many people become critical, rather than acknowledge there's anything wrong with the policy, there's a doubling down on the PR effort.
So, Roger, talk about a bit about the clip we just saw and how and why you think this campaign has been so successful.
Well, that's a very interesting point. Why it's been so successful? Because it's so transparent, and any rational man would think this cannot possibly work. But unfortunately, there's a lot of precedent for this particular technique. You know, if you tell the big lie often enough and loud enough, people will believe it. And you know, as is explained in this thing, in that clip. This has been used to sell soap powder or shampoo or motor cars often in the past, and it's used now to sell policy. And so it's exactly right that everything changed in '82 after the invasion of Lebanon. So I think it's about getting spokespeople as well, particularly politicians, to repeat the mantra. And this is one of the problems with the fact that Congress is for sale in this country, particularly after Citizens United, that the disastrous ratification of that bill by your Supreme Court. And so, which means effectively that members of Congress, both the Senate and the House, are for sale. You can buy them. And we all know that, and everybody knows it. But it's kind of something that people prefer not to talk about, because if you had owned up to it, you would need to start looking at the whole way that your society works and the politics of the United States in a grown-up and rational way, which would be very, very difficult, based as the whole thing is on commerce. I know I'm rambling, but you know, it's a complex issue. So if we get back to Hasbro, they have discovered that they can do it. They can operate policies that are murderous and genocidal and operate apartheid, which is a dirty word here particularly, but all over the world it's a dirty word, and recognize that apartheid is unforgivable and indefensible. And yet the Israelis operated in the territory that they occupied in 1967. And nobody says boo here. And you're asking the question, well, why does nobody say boo? Why is there no response to any of this? And I think Suk can answer that question much better than I can, because I confess I'm flabbergasted and flummoxed whenever I come up against this question, because their answers are so clearly a tissue of untruth that for us, we the people cannot see through it, and that still large numbers of us support Israeli policy, is very hard to penetrate. Ask Sir, he'll tell you.
All right. Well, he's here. I'll ask him.
Yeah.
And not only do you find this, support for Israel, even in the midst of an attack on Gaza, and I should point out that even a Bernie Sanders, who took, recently a much more balanced and complex view of how America should approach the question, but even Sanders voted for the resolution saying Israel had a right to defend itself at the time they're bombing Gaza. So, even in the Democratic Party, you have people with relatively progressive ideas. They oppose the war in Iraq and other things. And here I'm not isolating Sanders. There's others, certainly far more in this way. But they see Israel as this sort of outpost of civilization or something, and surrounded by, the forces of anarchy and chaos. And they kind of really internalize that.
The right to defend itself is part of the Frank Lutz mantra, because it covers a multitude of sins with one simple phrase that sounds, on the face of it, defensible. But defending a country like Israel by operating a collective, murderous, genocidal policy upon a neighboring people who are entirely under your control is not defense. It is aggressive beyond all imagination.
All right, so
this is the slaughter of people locked up in a concrete pen and kept there with guns, tanks, planes, ships, navies, machine guns. They are contained in a prison. It's exactly as if they were all in prison. And then if some of them resist, if some of them say, and I'm not defending the use of Qasim rockets to fire into farmland in Israel, which is where they go. They do not rain down on cities. There has never been any raining down of rockets. And certainly they have caused almost no casualties. The fatalities caused by rockets fired by Hamas or whoever else in Gaza are tiny, certainly by comparison with the loss of life that Israel causes with its hugely sophisticated weaponry when they attack this imprisoned population. So it's not defense. It has nothing to do with defense. That is the propaganda. That is the Hasbro that is repeated. And Obama said it repeatedly. Hillary Clinton says it. Every politician, even Sanders, as you say, he said it because it's something that you have to say. It's obligatory. You say Israel has a right. Of course Israel has a right to defend itself. All states have a right to defend themselves. People who don't have a right to defend themselves, of course, are the Palestinian people, because they don't have a state. They are a stateless people. They are an inconvenience on the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And that is what this is about. This is what Sut and I are working for. We believe that these people should have rights like everybody else does. None of us would, for a second, live under a situation where we had no civil rights, no rights to our own, to religion, to anything, no vote, nothing, where we were considered second-class citizens. We would resist. Now they, to their eternal credit, have resisted by and large in peaceful ways. And they've done it as much as they can, but you can only push people so far, and they will respond. And they have a moral and legal right to respond to military occupation.
So there's been a particular war in this PR war on American university campuses. And it's interesting that as the BDS movement has grown, but it certainly predates the BDS movement, it's been considered a very serious front of struggle for this PR campaign. Talk a bit about it.
I mean, the PR campaign is based around, the film is called The Occupation of the American Mind, and they've managed to occupy the American media so that this narrative is everywhere. And they've managed also to occupy the American Congress. So they've taken over the media and politics and the culture in general. The one place they haven't is the universities, where there actually is some diversity of thinking around this.
Okay, just before you go further, who's they?
Sorry, this is the Israeli PR campaign.
Which means the Israeli state.
Is the Israeli state.
Some major funders in the United States, Chaim Saban, Sheldon Adelson, and some others.
And also the American government itself. I mean, this is not Israel, controlling a government that wants to do something else. The reason it's worked so well is that the interests of the American government are very congruent with the interests of the Israeli state as well, which is why it's worked so well.
Because this is the narrative of the president, the State Department.
So this is not just an Israeli narrative, it becomes an American narrative as well.
I want to talk about the campuses.
But the campuses, I think it's very significant. It's the one place where there is any diversity of thinking around these issues. And so now, of course, the Israeli PR campaign has turned its focus there. And it's become, I think it's almost the last stage where this battle will be fought. But I think it's significant when American students actually have a choice. When American students actually have different perspectives, it's not surprising then that their opinion changes, and that is what the PR campaign is scared of. The PR always has two aspects. One is control the narrative, and the other one is maintain a monopoly, make sure there's no counter narrative. And on the universities, you're starting to have a counter narrative, and a very effective counter narrative. And and billionaires like Sheldon Adelson are now starting to put lots of money into making sure that alternative voice is wrapped up very quickly. Right. The way it's being done is through, they're scared stiff of BDS.
Boycott, divestment, sanctions.
Yeah, because it's actually, it's an effective story that's being told. And so what they're trying to do on American campuses is call BDS hate speech, and trying to ban it on that basis. We're in the middle of that. Where we will end up on it will depend upon how we struggle against it.
And there's places in Canada and even in Europe in certain places where this whole idea of BDS is so equated with hate speech, they're trying to make it illegal, advocating of it. Roger, one of the things that it seems to me helps drive this thing being that critiquing Israel is anti-Semitic, it's anti-Jewish, which is at the core of, you could say, this PR campaign. And one of the reasons why people can see images of children dying and images of the war and somehow get their head around, oh yeah, it's collateral damage and it's really these people's fault because they hate Jews. One of the reasons that works is there's a kernel of truth in the sense that while not all critique of Israel is anti-Semitic, some is. And there's certainly a deep-rooted history of hating Jews. Of course, this is more a European phenomena than an Arab phenomena. But for a lot of people, they don't get, because of the cultural history of Judenhass, that what's going on is not that. But isn't that an important piece of this?
Well, I think it's a great tragedy for the Jewish people and for the Jewish religion that it is conflated in people's minds with the policies of the government of Israel and its policies of colonization and its annexation of land that does not belong to it, the illegal occupation. Occupation. That is the most important word in all of these conversations. But I wanted to pick up on something that Sud said, which was the needs of the American government are in some way aligned with the goals and needs of the State of Israel. I don't necessarily agree with that, sir. And I certainly don't think that the needs and goals of the American people are in line with the goals of the State of Israel. I think they conflict hugely because American support for the goals of the State of Israel goes a long way towards creating not just an image, but a description of the United States of America as an oppressor of the people of the Middle East. And in consequence, it creates a lot of enmity towards this country, the United States of America, in that region as a whole. So I think that the unthinking automatic support of the state of Israel in its policies vis-a-vis its surroundings is actually bad for the people of the United States of America. It makes it harder for them to be respected, taken seriously, accepted as a partner to conversations that may find more edifying ways of conflict resolution than dropping bombs on one another, which routinely the United States does as well, as we know, with the drone policies. So I think it's actually very, very harmful to the potential that the United States might have to regain some of its position politically.
Right. And there's certainly recognition of that among American elites, that this policy is resulting in blowback. I mean, the answer to the question, why do they hate us? Well, one of the reasons is because of this unconditional support of Israel. And so even people like David Petraeus, when he was in power, was saying what the counter, what the effects of this was in terms of how America was being held. However, that's, on the one hand you have that, but until that outweighs the strategic value that the U.S. has in supporting Israel in the Middle East, and the Nixon administration called it a cop on the beat, and to protect its strategic interests. Until that outweighs those strategic interests, it's not going to make a difference. But there are, I mean, Roger's absolutely right. There are, I think, more and more even American elites who are starting to look at, what are the costs of this type of support. But at the moment, those costs have not outweighed what the benefits
are.
I
think you're kind of really agreeing, because it's about whose national interest. The elite's national interest and the American people's national interest are more often than not the same national interest.
What is super important is the issue of the campuses. There is now, because of the apartheid in the occupied territories, there is now a real groundswell of a genuine protest movement taking place in the young people on the campuses. And a lot of these young people, one has to say, are young Jewish people who care about their heritage, they care about their religion, they care about their own ethical standards, and they can see that they are being associated with a tyrannical regime that is a right-wing tyrannical regime that is running this small state in the Middle East, and they don't like it. They do not want their name taken in vain like that. So this is so important, what is going on. It's on the campuses of the universities in North America, both in Canada and in the United States, but it's also in the churches, which slowly but surely there is a creeping resistance to the slaughter. And more churches are gathering together in their annual synods and divesting from companies that support the settlements and the occupation, companies like Motorola and Caterpillar and the rest of them, and G4 and so on and so forth. So this movement is gaining momentum. There are many, many people, and this is an iceberg. Just the tip of it is showing above the surface. But the reason that Sheldon Adelson, Chaim Saban are pouring money to try and make this protest movement illegal is because they can see how fast it's growing. And it's growing because the protesters are right. They have right on their side. The treatment of the Palestinian people is deeply unjust and appalling. And the fact that we're not allowed to see Soot's film because it shows how we're not allowed to see that part of the narrative. I'm just so glad that The Real News is taking the time and the trouble to expose this to people, because it's fundamentally important to all of our humanity, not just the students, God bless them, who are protesting on the campus.
So tell us one more time, as we know, you can't see this on Netflix, at least not yet. Maybe if everybody writes Netflix and screams that we want it, that's an idea. For now, where do people see the film?
They can see it at www.occupationmovie.com. And you can stream it there, and you can buy the DVD as well. And one of the strategies that we have, I mean, we want as many people to see it as possible. I mean, we wish we could give it away and it'd be available for free.
It cost a lot of money to make that film.
Yeah, it cost us over $500,000 to make this film, and and trying to get it out has been. We knew it was going to be a struggle. We didn't actually realize it was going to be as much of a struggle as it has been. We thought we would be blanketed from the mainstream media just because of what the movie is about.
You're not getting another way you can get to the film streaming, which is, I think, $5 to watch the film, or you can buy a DVD, is on the Real News homepage. You'll see a copy of this movie poster. If you click on it, it will take you to the page where you can get to the film. As people who watch the Real News, they know I'm a documentary filmmaker. That's really my background. And this is a good film. But you're not getting into film festivals.
No, we're not getting into any American film festivals. We're getting into some foreign film festivals. Yeah. No, we've been blanketed in every single film festival that we've applied to. North American Film Festival.
Yeah, I just found out. I mean, I started the Hot Docs Film Festival, and I just found out I'm not involved anymore in day-to-day way. I just found out Hot Docs didn't accept it. Which, anyway, if you're in the Baltimore area, anywhere around, sometime in the next couple of months, we're going to screen the film. And I hope Roger and Sutter might even be able to come here for the screening. But at any rate, we're going to continue this discussion, and please join us for the next part of our interview with Roger Waters and Jhally on the Real News Network. Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. We're continuing our discussion with Roger Waters and Jhally. We're talking about the new film, The Occupation of the American Mind, Israel's Public Relations War in the United States. And you really I'm not going to introduce the guys again because you really should go back and watch this from the beginning because I think it's a fascinating interview. The importance of the next clip we're going to show you is that even some of the most liberal major media commentators buy in to the same narrative, Israel's victim, and seem very reluctant. And some of these people should know better or really do know better and don't want to say so, including Rachel Maddow. So here's a clip from the film.
Look at how American media covered Israel's 2014 attack on Gaza. A keyword search of all the major networks showed that over the course of the 51-day assault, Israel's ongoing military siege and blockade of Gaza were barely mentioned compared to the thousands of times Hamas rocket attacks on Israel were mentioned.
Why is Hamas launching missiles into population centers of Israel?
The basic propaganda frame is built into the very assumptions journalists bring to the table.
Since Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, 8,000 rockets have been fired from Gaza into Israel.
This is how propaganda works. It works by getting your words in the mouths of other people, especially the mouths of supposedly objective media commentators.
I'm wondering, though, whether you're outraged by the conduct of Hamas, starting the conflict by firing rockets, building tunnels to kill and kidnap Israelis, being more than willing to sacrifice Palestinian lives by embedding them into their own kind of arsenal and using them, as Israel contends, as human shields. Do you have a level of outrage at Hamas itself?
It doesn't seem like propaganda at all. It just seems like news. And this goes across all the major media, including the supposedly most liberal. Look at Rachel Maddow on MSNBC, who's known as the leading progressive voice on mainstream television. She did only 4 segments on the war. And during these few segments, she never once mentioned Israel's ongoing occupation of the West Bank or its siege and blockade of Gaza, and never once mentioned the fact that the US has armed Israel with the very weapons that were being used against the defenseless civilian population. Instead, choosing to frame the invasion as part of a senseless cycle of violence perpetrated by both sides.
It's been a constant cycle of fighting between Israel and Hamas for the past several years in Gaza. And the fighting and the cause of the fighting feel terribly familiar because this is basically a recurring war. And if it feels like deja vu, feels like, ugh, I've heard all of this before, you are right. because this really does keep happening over and over and over again.
Rachel Maddow, the most important woman on MSNBC, the leader when it comes to politics. In 6 weeks of war, never mentioned the word blockade, occupation, illegal settlements, never mentioned the support that Congress have for Israel, unconditional amount of money, billions of dollars. What is that? What a disappointment. Our media operations, national media, is a scandal when it comes to Israel.
That was Rachel Maddow, essentially doing the same thing as the rest of major media, including whether it's Fox or NBC or so on. Roger, you wanted to say something about the clip.
Well, yeah. It's a thing as well about the mainstream media, is that if you don't toe the party line, if you don't follow the line, and very particularly on Israel, you will be fired. You will lose your job. So it's no huge surprise that everybody takes the same line and says the same thing. Because people care about their salary at the end of the day, and people can be bought, and people can be sold. That is the nature of life in this country, and it's really sad.
I mean, it's interesting.
If you ask, even if you're in the press corps at the White House, if you ask difficult questions, you don't get asked to ask a question again, or you will not be invited, or you will not be on Air Force One flying off somewhere to cover a trip.
Yeah, we saw what happened to Helen Thomas.
You have to say the right things, or you won't be invited.
Yeah, Helen Thomas, I don't think it's mentioned in your film, but it's a very good example of what happens to a journalist who's a veteran White House journalist in the front row because of her seniority, and they hound her out of the press corps for asking exactly the kinds of challenging questions Roger's talking about. Yeah.
I mean, so on the one hand, there's the control of the narrative. At the same time, there's this culture of intimidation. So people are just scared to even, to ask basic questions around this, because they know what happens when you do. When you try and humanize the Palestinians in any way, you're immediately shut down. In the film, we have the example of Ayman Moyeldin, who was an NBC reporter who was playing soccer with 4 kids on the beach in Gaza, and just before they were killed by a missile. And when he posted the reaction of the parents to this, to the loss of their kids, NBC's reaction was to pull him out of Gaza. I mean, that when reporters see that, when reporters see what happens when you try and do the job of journalism. I mean, essentially, American media have given up journalism when it comes to this issue. Yeah. They've just given up trying to be journalists.
I critique Sanders for being part of that Senate vote, that Israel has a right to defend itself. But on the other hand, what he did say when he spoke recently about his Middle East policy, and actually said there's such a thing as Palestinian rights, which is ridiculous that should be a thing. The media reported on it and then completely moved on as if he kind of never said it. But it did show that the sky did not fall when Sanders said that. It's not like I don't think there's any evidence that he lost electoral support, even in New York State. Maybe some in some. I don't think Orthodox were probably voting for him anyway.
I think the Bernie Sanders moment was an incredible moment when he said that during the debate. I mean, part of what he said, even though it was very minor, he framed it by saying, of course, Israel has a right to defend itself, of course, and then he said a small part about Palestinian rights. But I think the most radical part, or the most interesting part of that, was the people in the audience cheering, which is an indication that something is happening. There is some crack amongst certain segments of the population around this issue.
Well, let's show another clip from the film, which is just about this, which is in fact how the narrative is changing. And let me declare a conflict of interest in the beginning of this, because in this clip, I think it's in the clip, but in the film at any rate, there's a mention of media outlets which are not following the official narrative here, and Real News is mentioned as one. But at any rate, here's the clip.
Over just the past few years, the proliferation of social media and internet news sources has made it increasingly difficult for the Israeli government and pro-Israel groups in the US to manage American perceptions of the conflict. Video footage and reporting from the ground bearing witness to the reality of the occupation are now more accessible than ever on the internet. In addition, over the past few years, a number of high-profile documentaries made by Israeli and Palestinian filmmakers alike have trained a harsh light on current Israeli policy and the repression of Palestinian rights.
זה כפר קטן, קטן. מה אתם חושבים? אין לכם לב? אין לכם משפחה? כל אחד מכם יודע זה אדמה של בלעים. אתם גנבתם אדמה שלנו.
At the same time, a powerful new boycott, divestment and sanctions movement has been gaining momentum and raising awareness of the occupation. While activists from the Black Lives Matter movement have been making explicit connections between police violence against African Americans and the Israeli military's repression of Palestinians.
We stand next to people who continue to courageously struggle and resist the occupation. People who continue to dream and fight for freedom. From Ferguson to Palestine, the struggle for freedom continues.
And all of these developments seem to be having an effect. Polls now show that while sympathy for Israel remains at all-time highs among older Americans, it has been hemorrhaging among young people.
Despite the efforts of the lobby, something really striking is taking place. Lots of young people are abandoning the mainstream media and turning instead to other independent sources. So they have a totally different way of making sense of what's happening, an unfiltered view of Israel's repression. And pro-Israel operatives like Frank Luntz are in a panic. In his latest report, he calls what's happening with young people a disaster and demands that Israel supporters respond. And people have answered the call. You have powerful right-wing billionaires like Sheldon Adelson, a major donor to Republican candidates, bankrolling a campaign to silence and intimidate student activists on college campuses. But it's not working. Groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, who see what's happening to Palestinians as a civil rights issue, have refused to be intimidated. They're refusing to back down, even though they're being labeled as anti-Semitic and terrorist sympathizers. And their numbers are growing.
As the discourse begins to open, more people are starting to understand this as a rights-based issue, not an issue of radicalism. This is a movement for the rights of people whose rights are being denied, who are living under occupation, who want to live in their country freely just like anybody else.
You can see just so many video clips of kids having their hands smashed by soldiers with batons. You can see just so many pictures of thousands of people being killed, as happened in Gaza. And at a certain point, there's a cognitive dissonance. You realize that what you're being told is a pack of lies.
The landscape is changing. As powerful as this media campaign has been, there are church organizations at the national level supporting boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel. Major unions have adopted this, certainly on campuses, student bodies. It's in spite of tremendous pressure being called essentially an anti-Semite. People are seeing past this. The mood seems to be changing.
Well, I think it's changing on the margins, in important places in the margins. So it's not a totally blanket thing anymore. There are places, young people, church groups, community groups. I think the new Black Lives Matter movement are seeing the connections between police violence in the cities here and military violence against Palestinians. So I think those connections are starting to be made, and they're being made on the margins. And I think what we have to do now is to take those cracks and make them a flood.
You know, there's an important one. It's in your film where I guess it's in the clip, one of the activists from Ferguson says, you know, from Ferguson to Palestine, we're fighting for freedom. Well, we see that in Baltimore. You know, Baltimore is a city that's 65% African American. And the link between the black activists in Baltimore feeling a real kinship with the struggle in Palestine, it's quite strong. In fact, more with Palestine than perhaps anything else going on in the world.
I was at a movie premiere a couple of weeks ago. It was Miles Ahead. I like the movie. It's about Miles Davis. But anyway, when they'd finished talking to Don Cheadle and who else was in it? I can't remember now. But a couple of reporters came over to me. One was from People magazine and one was from New York Daily News, neither of which publications I expect much sympathy from. Really interesting. A couple of years ago, or 3 or whatever, they might have asked me this question: why are you an anti-Semite? That's what they would have said to me then. Why are you so anti-Semitic? Now they say to me, and they both asked me the same question, they said, How do you feel when people accuse you of being an anti-Semite? Now that is a huge shift. It may sound subtle, but it's not. It opens up the question of whether I am anti-Semitic or not, which is a question that you couldn't even approach 2 or 3 years ago. It was just assumed that I was because you know, what's their name? The Wiesenthal, Simon Wiesenthal, you know, organization in Los Angeles had said I was, so therefore I must be. I think it's really interesting the way even in People magazine and the Daily News, the attitude is just changing a little bit. I'm so excited by it. It's so exciting to be here now and watch this thing turning around because the momentum is changing. The students and the churches and the people in Baltimore and Black Lives Matter joining together with their brothers and sisters in Palestine. And so it's becoming, the movement is spreading, and we care about the Black Lives Matter movement as much as we care about BDS. It's all fundamentally important because it's all about the fact that we're all human beings and there is no us and them. We are only us and all our lives matter. And once we can din that into people's hearts, we will be unstoppable as a movement. And I look forward to that time, and it's coming soon. I believe that. Sorry, I digressed.
No, not at all. So talk a little bit more about how you're going to get this film out.
I mean, I think Roger's absolutely correct. You know, and it's not accidental. It's not just that it happened, you know, out of nowhere. It's been the end result of a long period of activism by, you know, many people over the years. But I think we are now starting to see some daylight in small places. And I think what we now need to do is we now need resources to get people to think clearly about these things even more, and to you know, so that they can talk about these issues in a knowledgeable way. I mean, I think one of the things we wanted to do with our film, I don't think many people would be shocked to say, you know, to think that we're in the middle of a propaganda campaign by Israel. You look at the media. I mean, people are really frustrated. I know people were throwing things at their televisions during the last Gaza war. What the film does, and I think this is very, very powerful, what the film does is answer the question, why? And it gives people a way to peek behind the propaganda and to see how it has been put in place. And once you know how something has been put in place, you can start to take it apart. That's the value of doing this kind of work, which is why we hope the film will be shown, especially in community screenings and community settings, where you can have discussion around it. We have a whole strategy to make sure that it's shown on as many campuses as possible. If you're a professor, or if you're a graduate student, or if you're an undergraduate, get your library to buy it so it becomes part of the permanent collection. Organize a screening on campus. If you're a church group, or if you're a community group, organize a screening so that people can have a chance to come together to talk about this. Because I think the time is right, as Roger said. I don't think there's ever been a time like this. And the question is, do we take advantage of it? And do we have the resources to move things forward? Right. So it's a very, very hopeful period. And I hope the film will be part of that movement.
Well, this fight is obviously going to... So Roger, did you want to have a final word?
Yeah, here.
Here, okay.
Yeah, he's right. I agree with everything that Sut's saying. And I think it is an exciting time. And we shall overcome. You know, we are all in this together. And the more connections that human beings make with one another and recognize that one man's predicament is all of our predicaments.
One more time, Sut, where can people see the film?
People can see the film at www.occupationmovie.com. And they can stream it there, or they can buy a DVD to screen as well.
Another way you can get to the film streaming, which is, I think, $5 to watch the film, or you can buy a DVD, is on the Real News homepage. You'll see a copy of this movie poster. If you click on it, it will take you to the page where you can get to the film.
On July 8, 2014, Israel launched a devastating military attack on the Gaza Strip. Over the course of 51 days, the Israeli military dropped nearly 20,000 tons of explosive on Gaza, a densely populated area the size of Philadelphia, killing over 2,000 Palestinians and wounding tens of thousands more. The overwhelming majority of these casualties were civilians.
This strip of land is being bombarded from the air, sea and land.
Israel launched at least 160 strikes on the Gaza Strip. And there's one less hospital in Gaza now. Israel today flattened Wafa Hospital.
The sheer scale of the attack sparked outrage and condemnation around the world.
Israel's month-long pounding of Gaza shocked many people around the world. Mass demonstrations have been held in many of the world's major cities.
But in the United States, the story was different. Polls showed the American people holding firm in their support for Israel. Over the course of a conflict in which Palestinian casualties have far outnumbered Israeli casualties, the American people have consistently shown far more sympathy for Israelis than for Palestinians.
It's very difficult to divorce public opinion on any question from the media coverage that people rely on to form opinions. And I think the most prevalent lesson from looking at the coverage is that the coverage tends to see this conflict from the Israeli side.